Our next speaker is Elan Babchuck, founding director of the GLEAN Network. The GLEAN Network is an organization which helps equip spiritual leaders with the tools and mindsets they need to embrace the changing religious reality of the day and help them build skills for tomorrow. In this conversation, we talk a little bit about some of GLEAN's programs. We talk about how GLEAN helps adapt frameworks and tools from the startup world to different congregations. And we also talk a little bit about what Elan calls the unbundling of religion. Without further ado, Elan Babchuck. Elan, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So we originally chatted a couple months ago. For people who are less familiar with the GLEAN Network, can you maybe just give a quick background on what led you to that? I know you've got background in both the spiritual and maybe more the secular world, and kind of how that comes out in your work today.
Mm. So for me personally, I come from a background where 7 generations ago, the first rabbi in my family served in the northern Israel in Tveria, and so I'm 7 generations later still trying to figure out what that means. And on the other side of my family, I'm the third generation entrepreneur. I worked. Sort of was introduced to this work mostly through the lens of social entrepreneurship, then sort of got into commercial entrepreneurship, and ultimately, started to. I think from a very young age was able to look at the world through those two lenses in the following way. As a rabbi, I always ask, how can I serve people? And as a social entrepreneur, I always ask, how can I serve people? And it's just that the toolkits are slightly different. So what I do most of my days are spent kind of exploring the intersection between those two different wisdom traditions, and asking myself, how can I sort of balance and dig deep into both of those toolkits and possibly explore other ones too, to better serve people. And that means a lot of things to a lot of different people in a lot of different ways. And so really the origin around the GLEAN Network is, I became a faith leader. I became a rabbi for a lot of different reasons, but primarily because, or primarily at a time in my life when I was sort of experiencing the deepest darkness. My father was diagnosed with cancer when I was 17, and for the next few years, he had theological struggles. I did too. Mine very much mirrored his. But before he passed away, he left me with quite a few lessons about how to live life most fully, and among many other lessons. Taught me how to cook. I think he taught me how to really appreciate the world around me. He taught me how to pause. He taught me how to love. He taught me a lot. But as I was sitting Shiva, which is kind of the set of mourning practices in the Jewish tradition after you lose a loved one, I looked around the room, and it was my first time sort of in a Jewish community in several years. I had sort of opted out after he was diagnosed with cancer, and then all of a sudden, in this really dark moment in my life, I'm back in it. And I looked around the room and I thought to myself, I don't know what this is, this gathering that's happening right now with all these rituals and practices and food and prayer and storytelling. But this is what I need to be doing in the world. And I came out, so fast forward from that point, let's see, almost 10 years between that point and when I became ordained as a rabbi. And what I found was that what I was doing on an everyday basis was actually felt far removed from that drive, from that passion around gathering people, bringing them together, making meaning together, helping people find purpose in an increasingly sort of meandering, challenging, amorphous set of circumstances in our lives. And so GLEAN came out of this revelation that for many of my clergy colleagues, and I was experiencing this myself, there was a growing frustration that the narrative in and around religion is one of erosion, where we're serving congregations that are really so, I think, stuck in this idea that we're fighting against irrelevance, and we're fighting against disappearing, and we need to focus on building up our numbers and getting more people to do more things. And that with that focus, that what comes from a place of scarcity, you can really lose sight of your own purpose, of that. Here's why I'm here in the first place. It's because of that drive to want to gather people. But what am I worried about at the end of the day is how many members do we have, and how big is the budget, and can we fix the building, and can we, maintain all of these practices and rituals that we've been doing all this time without really pausing for a moment to reflect on, why we're here, and can we do this better? Can we do this differently? Is it time to, just pause for long enough that we can notice new opportunities and new gaps, through that entrepreneurial lens, that might allow us to serve people better, to gather people better, to help them make meaning in their lives better. And so GLEAN really came out of that drive, this reflection that we're in this incredible moment of change, especially in the world of religion. Somewhere between 4,000 and 10,000 churches are closing every year in America.
Right.
The increased secularization of America is, continuing to take hold. And yet, even though those things on the surface sound really scary from the inside world in religion, what they mean is we have an incredible opportunity to reimagine what we're doing and how we're doing it, and how we serve. And for those who are theologically inclined, how and where God shows up in the world. A friend of mine used this reference the other day, actually a graduate of one of GLEAN Network's programs last year. He said, and he comes from a Wesleyan theology. He says, we came to understand, and he was serving a church that was really reimagining how they were doing church. He said, we came to understand that God's presence is always here. It's just a question of whether or not we're here to notice it. Huh. And so I think, again, going back to this question, why do we start GLEAN? And it's really because we feel that now is a moment of incredible opportunity. And in order to embrace that opportunity, to really serve people and reimagine the role of religion in the world today, we need some new tools. We need some new mindsets. And we need some new language too. And it's not just about repackaging what once was in a shinier package or branding it better. It's really about going back to the core of what's our call. Why are we called that way? What's our purpose? What's the job of religion? It's a 10,000-year-old industry. Why was it around in the first place? It's got to be more than just to make tribes and to, keep the other tribes from killing us. There's more to it. And so I think that practice, that work of going back to our roots, going back to the core, and then reimagining it from that core outwards. It's an emergent process, but we've been really, I think, edified and excited by how these first few years have gone.
Cool. Yeah, it's a super interesting perspective. Change is scary, but change also means opportunity, right? And it seems like you all are very much embracing that.
Absolutely.
Could you speak maybe a bit specifically to what some of the new mindsets, new tools, or new languages that you've seen have been helpful for some of the clergy who've come through your programs, or just that you've discovered that's been helpful for yourself?
Absolutely. Let's see, some new mindsets. I think the tools around customer discovery and human-centered design, or another theory that we use that underlies all of this, is a theory called jobs to be done theory.
Right.
And I think that set of tools, when we use them regularly, can lead to our own. It sort of allows us to build up the instinct before even if you've got the best idea and it came to you in the shower, right, or in your garage. There's that myth of the garage and the work of entrepreneurship. No matter how good you think your idea is, go talk to 10 people who you think might be experiencing the problem that your idea is going to solve, or that might help them make the progress that you think your idea can help people make. And that instinct of people before programs has been, I think, let's say at the best, if I'm going to give the most credit, it's been disincentivized for many a faith leader because the work is so demanding. What do you mean? I have to pause and go interview 10 people for 45 minutes before I can just get this program off the ground, and I don't have time to do that. And at the worst, I actually think not just disincentivized, but I actually think it's been sort of uh, um, like extracted from what it means to be a faith leader at the worst, in the worst version of it, because the one of the mindsets that is sort of instilled in many faith leaders coming out of school is, well, I just went to school for graduate school for 3 years or 5 years or 6 years. I have this whole toolkit full of answers.
Right.
And you're telling me that I need to go start asking questions? That's not what I'm trained to do. I'm trained to give answers. That's why I spent a whole year learning how to write a sermon. And so that tool, I think, is the single most important one.
Right.
Start with people, understand people. How do they live their lives? What do they struggle with? What keeps them up at night? What inspires them to jump out of bed in the morning? What brings peace in their heart and what makes them feel anxious? That's the number one thing. Across all of our programs, across all of our fellowships, if that's the only thing that our participants, our graduates walk away with, it's that instinct. Now, on top of that, we use different approaches to innovation work. Sometimes with as individuals, sometimes with teams. So I think just a certain toolkit around innovation is really important. A third is the principle. Some of our principles around diversity, and we believe that when you really invest in and commit to diversity, not just for, I think when you do it for the right reasons and you really commit to it, that the results are when it comes to innovation work and entrepreneurship work, that the results can be incredibly rich when everyone around the table really feels heard and really feels like they can show up holistically who they are as they are,
Right.
and that they can speak up who they are as they are. That what you end up finding is lower rates of systems failure. I read a great book called Meltdown recently that really advocated for this, but also much more increasing rates of creativity, productivity, and new ideas in an innovation process. So I think those are, if I were to list three, those are probably the three most exciting takeaways around like the mindsets, the tools, and the foundations of being able to reimagine faith through this work of innovation and design.
Right. Yeah, very interesting. So jobs to be done is a framework I originally heard about coming from like the startup world. I'm curious if maybe you have an example of how it's been used by like in a specific use case by a faith community to either, I guess, find a program or realize that a program that they're about to launch wasn't the right idea or anything like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is something I worked on. And I think for folks who are just kind of tuning in, jobs to be done is essentially a theory that that states that that every person seeks to make some kind of progress in their lives, to go from the real self to the ideal self, and that's a much sort of that's almost like the 30,000 foot view of jobs to be done. And also just on a very concrete level, there's also certain day-to-day tasks that people need to get done. Very often we as the producer or the teacher or the entrepreneur or the whatever will ascribe a certain set of needs onto the people who are using a certain product. So in other words, you might say, well, Casey's wearing those headphones. I'm going to ascribe onto Casey that he's wearing those headphones because he, wants to have surround sound on, and he really loves surround sound. Now, it might turn out that 75% of the people who buy those headphones actually are doing it because they work in a co-working space and they want to signal to other people, don't bother me. I'm in the middle of focusing in my work and I'm easily distracted and I don't want you to talk to me. So when, rather than ascribing to you, oh yeah, go ahead.
Gotcha. Actually, this is maybe a great example because the reason I have these headphones is because it's got a mic,
There
and
you go.
my MacBook's like internal mic no longer works because it's an old computer. So this is, I guess, an exact example of assuming the reason behind a product.
It's a perfect example. It's a perfect, so actually the headphones are a solution. They're a hack to solve some other problem that I didn't even know about. And I pretend that I'm in the headphone business. What do I know? So anyway, that's the essential theory is that people have social, emotional, and functional needs that a product or an experience can fulfill. And until you really understand what those needs are, you're going to have a difficult time connecting to the people that you hope to serve. So I'll tell you my own example. It is very common in the Jewish world to assume that parents of children who are 8 or 9 or 10 years old, when they join a synagogue at that period of time, are doing it for one reason and one reason alone. And that is to get their kids a bar or bat mitzvah, which is the coming of age ceremony that children celebrate at age 12 or 13. And most synagogues have certain policies. You need to be a member for at least a few years in order to become a part of this. So, and then what happens afterwards is the family is very likely to leave the synagogue once the kid is done with the ceremony. And so then there's this interesting like cycle of holding the carrot further away and then resenting them once they've eaten the carrot, when you made it clear that you believe that the synagogue professional believes that the only reason you're coming is for this carrot. And eventually the person who becomes a member of the synagogue, whose kid is about to become a bar mitzvah, is going to start internalizing that projection. Well, yeah, of course, the only reason I'm here is for this carrot. So as soon as I get it, I'm out of here. Creates a transactional, tense, not very generative relationship. And it shows. Now, here's the interesting thing. When you think about what the parents, what that age group, parents who have let's say a 10-year-old kid, and maybe it's not their first kid, maybe they have an older kid, but a roughly 10-year-old kid, those adults, their parents are now entering their late 60s, early 70s, right? Maybe even mid 70s, late 70s. So their parents are starting to have health problems. And those adults, the ones with the 10-year-old kids, are entering into the sandwich generation. So when I did this jobs to be done process, what you do is you actually go back to the very first time that they thought about joining the synagogue. And it wasn't when the kid was 8 or 9 or 10. For a lot of these folks, it was the first time their parents got sick. The first time the parent falls and breaks a hip, or parent gets sick and goes to some kind of extended care rehab facility, or right. Those are the trigger points, but they don't join the synagogue. But what they do feel is a yearning for community.
Right.
And then the second time is another thing around experiencing yourself in the sandwich generation and not wanting to raise your kids outside of community. It's just that synagogue doesn't kind of feel like the right. And then it's finally the tipping point when the kid meets that age and it's okay. It's now or never, because they can't join at 11 or 12 or 13 because I need at least 3 years of prep before this happens. So I actually trained synagogue rabbis to do jobs to be done interviews. And what they came to understand is, oh my God, like literally, oh my God. For 20 years, I've been serving this congregation. And for 20 years, I've assumed that all of these people who join at the last possible minute and then leave at the first possible minute are just using me for a bar bat mitzvah. And they're paying the bare minimum and they're spending the bare minimum. And then it turns out, oh my God, I was projecting that need onto them. And for 3 years that they actually were members, the only way that I related to them was as the parents of the bat mitzvah. So the only time I wrote them an email was, hey, your daughter, needs to practice A, B, and C. And the only time that they got any contact from me was, hey, don't forget to schedule this thing and this thing. And don't forget, you have to jump through this hoop and that hoop in order to pick the date and then come to the bat mitzvah. And then, of course, when they leave, I resented them, because how dare they use me when there's all of these other wonderful things happening in the synagogue. So one of the ways that this actually led to real programming was one of the rabbis created a sandwich generation affinity group. So that and it was facilitated by a social worker with the rabbi, so that the income, and it wasn't just like, hey, you just joined, come to this thing. But as soon as it became known that this is actually a value that we have, that you're going through something that is so unbelievably challenging, in which your own mortality is going to be brought up, in which just the fragility of life is going to become so present for you as you're celebrating this amazing milestone for your child. You're also recognizing that, wow, we're all aging and it's just happening so fast and I don't know what to do and which way is up. And we're going to create space for you. And it transformed the relationship with those incoming families, such that people were actually joining earlier and earlier because they themselves were being seen as whole human beings, not just as this one tiny element of their life, which is a parent of a 10-year-old kid.
Right. Very interesting. That's a powerful example from personal practice. And it leads to a question that I didn't have on my radar for today, but I think might be a nice little segue, which is, Casper and Angie have written a lot about how for some people who are less religiously affiliated, secular communities might be playing some of the role that religious communities might have played in a previous generation, right? And that fits very nicely with this whole idea of the jobs to be done framework, where there is a job to be done. Maybe it's community, maybe it's belonging, maybe it's some sense of kind of like a framework for understanding the world. And they're finding that maybe in CrossFit or in Weight Watchers or in some other community, right? But one kind of thing I've been sitting with a question is, a lot of these secular ideologies, they may have community and they may have a framework for kind of interacting with the world on some level, but not a lot of them touch into that deeper level of kind of dealing with death and suffering and mortality. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on, is that something you think that secular communities can tap into, or do you think that really is the kind of, job, if we will, to kind of, I imagine some people in the faith world might want some deeper language around that. Maybe this is where new languaging needs to come in to merge some of the spiritual and the secular. But I'm curious whether you think maybe that's also the kind of like thing that is what brings people to religion in the first place and is what is hard to find outside.
Wow, that's a great question. I think there's incredible opportunity for new language across. I think that for folks in the religious world who bristle at the idea of bringing secular language or business language or entrepreneur innovation language, jobs to be done, like, let's just sit with it for long enough that it might actually impact us, or it may actually sort of deepen our resolve around our existing set of language. And likewise, I think in the word spiritual has been appropriated and misappropriated and applied and misapplied and understood and misunderstood to the extent that it can mean everything from the deepest, most concrete, rooted practice that one is committed to for a lifetime to the most fleeting. I'm in front of the microwave. I put my burrito in for 30 seconds and I take one deep breath, and that's a spiritual practice. And both of those things are great. It's just a huge, broad spectrum. I think specifically around death practices, I'll start there, and then hopefully we can think bigger together. From my own personal experience, that when I was mourning the loss of my father, I felt like these practices, these rituals around death, and I come from a Jewish background, so that set of rituals and practices and liturgy, it felt like it was cutting edge, and it was written 1,000 years ago. And it felt like it must have been designed by the smartest sociologists in conversation with the smartest psychologists, in conversation with the smartest anthropologists, in conversation with, it felt like it must have been this incredible multidisciplinary thing that, and there's no way this thing must have been invented over 1,000 years ago, that they just knew that, you know what, I need 7 days to just shut down. And I need to sit on a lower chair than everybody else, so that when they come in, they understand that's the person who experienced loss, and they are literally and physically at a low point. And I'm going to sit with them and be a part. I'm not going to try to lift them up or cheer them up. That's not happening. The chair is what it is that they're sitting on, but I'm here to sit with them and recognize that they're at a low point, and not to sit in that same low chair.
Mm.
That if I'm a guest at a house of mourning, I can't wear that hat. I don't know what it feels like to be you right now, but I'm going to sit right next to you and I'm going to be with you. And after that, and the 7 days, you cover your mirrors because you shouldn't have to worry about how you look. And you don't cook one meal. Everyone brings in the food for you. You shouldn't have to worry about how to feed yourself. You just sit with the grief. And then for 30 days, you start to wean yourself back into some regular practice and regular life, but you still don't shave. You don't worry so much about how you look. Don't go to the movies. Don't go to, and then 11 months you're working. But here's the thing, you have to be around at least 10 people every day in order to pray the mourner's prayer in Jewish life.
Mm.
You only need 2 people for a wedding, but you need at least 10 for the next 11 months to make sure that you're supported by community in order to be able to say that prayer. Like,
Every day.
that is so smart. It
Wow.
is so smart. And every step of the checkpoint, after 7 days, after 30 days, after 11, there's different rituals to sort of say, okay, we're going to go from that place into this place. And I know that it kind of feels artificial. Maybe you're not really ready. Maybe you need to be in that day time a little more. And like, but we're going to kind of move through this process and recognize that there's still going to be broken pieces along the way. And we're going to bring the broken pieces with us.
Mm.
Now, I think we need to talk about death better everywhere, in religion, in the secular world. If you look, there's this great article about them death rehearsals. There's a practice, I think it's growing out of Japan, these death rehearsals where you literally sit in a coffin and your friends eulogize you while you're still alive. Because what is the whole point is so that we can be reminded of how fragile life is, how little time we're promised on this world, if any, and to go and do something with it. And whether it's find purpose or, really live into the love that we have in our hearts, or serve the people around us, or leave the world a little bit better than it was when we found it. It doesn't, whatever it is that you live for, it's a reminder to live. The funerals are for the living, right? And so I think, I really do believe this, that if in the secular world, I don't care if it happens at CrossFit, I don't care if it happens, I think if in the quote unquote secular world, and I don't really believe like there's a secular religious binary divide. I think it's all fluid. But I think if we're talking about firmly in the secular world, if we can do death better and talk about death better, then we'll be able to live better and talk about life better. And but I think it has to have, it can't be done in a flippant way. I do think there's a depth and a rootedness that I see happen really beautifully. I think the dinner table, I think, is what it's called.
The dinner party?
Dinner party, right? They do it so beautifully. What's it called? Our House. It's a franchise of, or it's a series of grief, like sort of grief counseling communal organizations all around the country. Places like that where it doesn't need to come from a religious standpoint. So I think if in the quote unquote secular world we can do death really, really well, then let's also do personal transformation really, really, really well, and accountability really, again, using Casper and Angie's set of language.
Right.
And then on the other side, in the world of religion, and this is where when we train our faith leaders as entrepreneurs, don't try to do all the things for all the people like we used to try to do. Pick a lane, really be a niche, find the thing that you're most passionate. If you're most passionate about getting people across boundaries and outside of echo chambers to talk with one another and hopefully be transformed by those conversations, then that's your lane. And then start there and then grow from there. And maybe there's other sort of, adjacent jobs to be done that you might expand into. But as a faith leader, to try to be everything for everybody, A, you're going to be exhausted, and B, then you're going to be in competition not only with CrossFit, but then you're in competition with Netflix, and you're in competition with Google, and you're in competition with Facebook, and it's exhausting, and it's just overwhelming and too much. So we always say pick a lane, and I think in the secular world too, I think there can be more expansion and deepening of the way that those jobs are getting done in the let's say non-religious world too.
Cool. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Um, Maybe switching gears just a little bit, could you actually talk about maybe some of the specifics of the programs you have, like Shift, Start, and what does that program look like for the people who go through them?
Sure. By the way, along the lines of the last piece, there's a great article about the unbundling of religion.
Mm,
It's worth. I'll see if I can find it. But one of my colleagues, Rabbi Erwin Kula, wrote an article for Big Think about how many industries are getting unbundled, just like you used to get your cable, your wireless, and your phone from the same company. That a lot of companies that used to offer multiple services are getting unbundled that way, and
right.
that happened. Certainly, it happened in religion, and it's causing the domain of religion to kind of rethink how it offers.
Maybe before jumping then into the question I just asked, could you talk a little bit more about like what specifically that means? Is that like congregational life versus theology versus, yeah.
Great. Yeah, the unbundling. So yeah, let's say at a traditional house of worship, you can come in for life cycles. Maybe you came in because you just had a baby and you want the pastor to sort of celebrate through a naming ritual or a baptism, or you're going to get married, or God forbid someone in the family passed away and you need someone. So life cycle that's a set of jobs that traditionally you would go to a house of worship to do that set of jobs.
Right.
Now you have itinerant clergy because there's so much unemployment and underemployment in the clergy space, and the lowering of bars. You have the ULC, United Life Church. You can go there and get an ordination certificate in 10 seconds. So there's all
Right.
kinds of folks where those lines are getting blurred who are doing a la carte life cycle rituals. Right? And by the way, some of them do it better than clergy who are based in houses of worship, and vice versa, of course.
Right.
Uh, so that's one way that the traditional house of worship, which had a monopoly on life cycle rituals, not to mention the justices of the peace and other folks who are doing it in a secular space, that's one way that churches got unbundled or synagogues got unbundled. Another might be beyond the life cycle ritual, gathering spaces. The only place you could really get that kind of third space gathering and accountability, let's say in the 50s and 60s, maybe you were in the Elks Club or the Rotary Club, or you were at a country club or something like that. But for the most part, it was going to be in a religious organization. And, as Robert Putnam wrote in Bowling Alone, we've seen the complete deterioration of those intermediary institutions, those Elks Club, Rotary Club, Neighborhood Club, et cetera. Those are gone.
Right.
And so again, that's a place where if you were looking for community, you might not go to a synagogue. So that's another way that synagogue got unbundled, church got unbundled, and the jobs are getting done elsewhere, but in a very niche, specialized way. And that's how I think, similarly, if you look at what happened with people cutting the cord and their cable is disappearing, it's mostly done in a niche, specialized way until the more successful competitors start to expand their offerings. Like Netflix was pretty niche when it first came out, and now they're producing hundreds of shows a year,
Right.
by expanding what they did. So that's kind of what we're seeing, I think, in the world of religion. And by the way, this isn't to say that religion disappearing. It's still the third largest industry in America. It's a $1.2 trillion industry. It brings in more revenue than the top 10 tech companies combined. We have 344,000 congregations in the country. We're doing okay. But I think it's a matter of, okay, things are shifting pretty quickly. How can we adapt at this? How might we adapt in this moment?
Right. Cool. Maybe just briefly, could you talk about the,
Yeah.
man, I feel like we could talk for a long time, but we only have like 5-10 minutes left. Maybe we could just chat a little bit about what the programs are.
Yep.
And we'll see if I have one more question. We'll see if we have time for it, but let's.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll do this briefly. So we've got, really, there are 3 different programs that we're working on, and I can give you the sort of status update now on all 3 that our website doesn't even reflect because everything changes every day.
Of course.
So the first one, and we're just about to finish our 3rd cohort, is called Start. This is all under the GLEAN Network umbrella. Start is our partnership with Columbia Business School, where we train what we call spiritual entrepreneurs, who are folks who are building new models of faith in action. And what that means for us is it could be anything from a new think tank that called Sinai and Synapses that explores the intersection between faith and spirit and science. It's a fascinating project founded by Rabbi Jeff Midland, to um, everything from that to Reverend Q English in New York, who founded Not on My Watch, which is a nonprofit organization that seeks to break the cycle of human trafficking. So that's about as wide as the bounds can get. To a guy named Drew Rao, who's building a kind of an app-based interface called Journey that gives people an opportunity to kind of explore and try on multiple worldviews and theologies from a myriad of different faith traditions and some non-faith traditions, and sort of not pick and choose like it's a little from column A, a little from column B, but basically try them on to better understand where they themselves are coming from, and then perhaps to have that impact what their own belief system is. So it's really a wide variety. And we're closing our third cohort next week at Columbia Business School, and we're really excited about that. Shift is the initial idea for that was, let's put this out to faith leaders who are serving existing institutions. And the major focal points for Shift are: one, help them better understand the shift in American in the American religious landscape. Why are people not affiliating as much? What's changing? Two, understand how they themselves might shift alongside it. So to go from this like fixed mindset to a growth mindset, to go from a narrative of erosion or scarcity to a narrative of abundance. That's the second. And then the third part is a little more of an introductory experience with the tools around human-centered design, innovation, and entrepreneurship. So that's that course. And it turns out actually the people who were most excited about it, not only were there faith leaders out in the field who were interested, but seminary leaders. So leaders of seminaries in the US were really excited about it. So we are now developing, and we're in conversation with Ashoka on this, and they're the international organization that basically founded the field of social entrepreneurship. We're working with them to develop this curriculum that will be in seminaries. Right now, we've got 8 seminaries that we're working closely with who will offer it next year. So we're in development there. Wow. And then a third fellowship that it's under a separate umbrella, but we're going to bring it in under GLEAN, is called the Spark Fellowship. And that's where we take leadership teams from existing institutions and we introduce them to the tools around innovation and design, sort of the same set of interventions, but we go through 2 design cycles where they do 2 rounds of customer discovery, 2 design sprints, come up with 2 sets of ideas, get feedback, etc., all with an eye towards using Adrienne Marie Brown's emergent strategy, using growing the base of innovators, the internal group of innovators, growing it with each cycle, so that it's not just about the thing you came up with, but it's about having a culture of ownership and innovation inside of the institution, so that by the time we're done with that 9 or 12 month experience, that you went from having one person committed to building the future and reimagining the institution to having as many as 50 or 60. Wow. And that's really where you start to see innovations transform. There's a tipping point. We believe in the 16%. So it's about, when you get 16% of a given community that is really committed to that idea and the work, that's when you start to see real transformation happen.
Where does that number come from?
The 16%, there's a number of, if you look at like systems change theory, the idea is that the studies that they've done under the auspices of system change is that once you hit a 16% threshold of the number of stakeholders in a given system, and they're all pushing towards change, that's when you're going to start seeing increasing returns around your whatever interventions you're using. So I know Ashoka subscribes to that number, actually, and it's proven out quite a bit in their work creating change maker communities, that when they find, if they're working in a school system, in a given district, and they can get 16% of the staff people, or 16% of the parent body, or 16% really committed to the work of change making, of changing the culture, of thinking differently about education, of working together, et cetera. That's where they go from a really heavy investment of time to being able to watch things happen in a much more organic way, and they can kind of step back and watch the transformation happen.
Cool. Very cool. I guess it's almost like until you have that 16%, that's the most important thing to focus on. And then afterwards,
absolutely,
focus on more, I guess, like specifics or small things.
Yeah.
Elan, I realize it's about the time we had scheduled. I want to kind of be cognizant of that. Really appreciate you taking the time to hop on. You got so many interesting ideas, and programs are so fascinating. Maybe just one quick question to finish it up. Are there any books or resources that have been like particularly impactful for you that you would recommend to kind of other community builders, gatherers across the spiritual secular spectrum?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. This is a great question. Community builders. Okay. So obviously you've got Priya Parker as a teacher here. So that one, The Art of Gathering, without question. There's a book called Competing Against Luck, which teaches jobs to be done theory. It's really great. A more distilled version of it is How Will You Measure Your Life by Clayton Christensen. It's actually an application of a number of his business theories applied to his own life, which he wrote at a time of great change in his own life. And beautiful. How Will You Measure Your Life is just a gorgeous book. What other books, as you're bringing people together? Let me think about a couple of others that I think are great. Oh, Adrienne Marie Brown's Emergent Strategy is incredible, really, really important. I think, I do think at least it should, that in a moment like this, in which you're gathering people together, that identifying what your purpose is around the gathering, and who and how you want the folks who are around the table to be impacted is a really important question.
Yeah.
And I think in this moment in time, a lot of the folk that I talk to who are in this, gathering work are also focused on thinking about justice work and about building power and building power through community. And so I think spending a little bit of time in some of the earlier community organizing books, like Cold Anger is an amazing book about community organizing. Roots for Radicals. Like, I come from the Saul Alinsky Industrial Areas Foundation community organizing tradition. So I think spending a little bit of time with some of those books, which are already 4 decades old or 3 decades old, I think would be really valuable in this moment to also think about when you're gathering people together, you are harnessing such potential. You're bringing people together in a way, in a time that will never, ever happen again. This group of people around this table sharing these conversations and these stories will never, ever, ever happen again. And so what do you want to make of that? Not to turn it into something transactional or objectify it, but simply to recognize that there's just immense power in gathering. And my hope is that power can be harnessed for good.
What a note to close on. Well, thanks again so much for your time, and we'll put some links to some of your projects in the description, so you can find them more online.